Hello, I'm Dan, the EDC academic. Thank you for watching. The topic of today's video is serrations, and if you've ever visited the comment section of a YouTube video about knives, you know how contentious of a topic that can be. And I'm not going to, pretend that I'm going to be resolving any issues surrounding that today. I'm not attempting to change anybody's opinions or convince somebody of the correctness or incorrectness of a position regarding serrations. I'm just going to talk about serrations and the role they play in my carry decisions. And I have here sharing on the screen with you some examples of serrations. I have a knife that has a dedicated serrated blade, two knives that have half serrations, bottom half and top half, and then I have a knife that has one blade without serrations and one blade with serrations. So let's start with the fully serrated knife at the top there. This is the Victorinox Skipper. And I'll interrupt the video really quickly to talk about these two knives and just to mention that the Victorinox has discontinued these. This is the Victorinox Skipper, this is the Victorinox Hunter. And I know that sometimes people get frustrated whenever people are talking about knives that aren't readily available. But even though they've been discontinued, and Victorinox hasn't released a statement to the effect that they've been discontinued. But if you go to Victorinox's site, at least the US version of Victorinox's site, and if you search for these models, the Skipper, the Hunter, they will show up, but they don't show up for sale. If you bring it up, it'll say, it just shows you a screen that says find online. And then you click the button that says find online and it says no available retailers. So even though I haven't seen any documentation that would give in regard to an official statement from Victorinox to the effect that these two models have been discontinued. Reading the tea leaves, they've been discontinued. And now that being said, these are still available through Amazon retailers. You can get the Skipper for about 95 bucks. You can get the Hunter for about 70 bucks. You can get them a little bit cheaper in the secondary market, but they hold their value. The Skipper is widely available on eBay for about, the $70, $75 mark, but then you're going to be paying, $8, $10 shipping. And so it's almost as much as new. And the same regards with the Hunter. You can find the Hunter for about, the $35 to $45 range, depending on condition. But again, you're going to be paying, $8, $9 for shipping there, and that's now you're getting in the neighborhood of what you can get them for brand new. So with those comments out of the way, the fully serrated knife. The fully serrated knife, the traditional use, the traditional thought process behind a fully serrated knife is that the edge lasts longer, and the traditional wisdom is that it is better for certain cutting applications. In particular, it is better for cutting through cordage and fabrics. And so given the nature of this knife, again, this is a knife dedicated to maritime applications. The assumption is that if you're using a knife out on the sea, out on the water, that the primary use case of the knife is going to be fabrics, canvases, sailing material, that sort of thing, and cordage. So there's only one blade on this knife, and the blade that you get is a serrated one. And that is, like I said, that's the traditional wisdom behind the serrated edge. And I'll mention at this point that Felix Imler recently released a video in which he was challenging that traditional wisdom, and he was doing a test. And I love Felix Imler, but I disagree. I have to dispute, or at least challenge, both his methodology and his conclusions and I'll provide a link to that video in the description, and I'll attempt to embed it up in the corner here as I'm talking about it. But Felix Imler's conclusion was that there really wasn't a substantial difference in cutting cordage, specifically was his test, with either a plain edge or a serrated edge. But his methodology I question, and of course I question his conclusion on the basis of what I perceive to be an incorrect methodology. He was testing cutting cordage using natural fibers on a cutting board. Please excuse the interruption, but I need to offer a correction. The comments that I just made were made on the basis of my memory of Felix Imler's video from several years ago. And I after I recorded this video, I went back afterwards and to watch Felix's original video to remind myself of what he actually said, which was stupid. I should have done that before I made my own video. But I did catch it in time to at least correct it in post-production. What Felix Imler was doing, he did test it both on synthetic cord and on natural fiber cord. And he concluded that with the synthetic cord, he said that there was no practical difference, and he even gave the slight advantage to the plain edge over the serrated edge. But with the natural fiber cord, he did acknowledge that the serrated edge was slightly better on the natural fiber rope than on the synthetic rope. Now, that being said, he only did his test using a cutting board. He was not cutting the rope, the cordage, the way that somebody in the field would be cutting rope and cordage. So even though my memory of what Felix said was incorrect, his methodology, my memory of his methodology was absolutely correct. So just for purposes of clarification, what Felix Imler, his test, it was on a cutting board, and he was using both a plain edge and a serrated edge, and he was using both types of rope. He was using rope that had the synthetic fiber and the natural fiber. For the synthetic fiber, he said that the plain edge was actually better than the serrated edge, and for the natural fiber rope, he said that the serrated edge only had a very slight advantage over the plain edge. But again, his methodology was the same. He was using a cutting board, and he gave the overall advantage to cordage in general to the plain edge. So I will post a link in the video, and I will let you watch that on your own. Pay attention to that video, especially beginning at the 10-minute and 25-second mark. And now I will return you to my video. And I would submit that if you're in the field, you're almost never cutting natural cordage, natural rope, natural fiber rope on a cutting board, on a cutting surface. In my experience, and anytime I've ever been witness to somebody cutting cordage in the field, in an actual field scenario, it's been a synthetic fiber cord, and without the use of a cutting board. Turning the cordage over in your hand, grabbing the implement and cutting it like that. That is an actual real-world use case scenario, and Felix Imler just wasn't doing that. He only used one type of cord. He used natural fiber rope, and he was sawing back and forth on a cutting surface such as what you see in the background. And under his use case scenario, under his testing scenario, he concluded that there wasn't any difference. Again, I dispute that. I love Felix. I love watching him. He is a joy to watch. But I really challenge the conditions under which he did the test. Now, the rest of my comments are going to be built on the supposition that serrated edges are in fact better for cordage, and they are in fact better for most fabrics that you would want to be cutting in a field situation. So that's the fully serrated knife, and the decision and the reason why manufacturers typically will decide to include a serrated edge. And also there's the preference of individual users. I have very few knives that have serrations on them. This is pretty much it, what you see in front of you. And that's because of both my needs and my preferences. I don't have a need for a serrated edge, typically speaking, in my everyday carry. So because it's not part of my need, I just prefer not to go through, have the extra hassle of sharpening. And so serrated edges are consistent with neither my needs, and they're certainly not consistent with my preferences. But everyone's needs and preferences are different. So that's the reason why manufacturers offer the serrated edges. So I'm going to put that fully serrated knife off to the side. And now I'll talk about the half serrations. The half serrations are, to my mind, kind of useful again, in sort of certain applications, but if a knife is going to have half serrations, I actually prefer the serrations on the top half rather than the bottom half. I think that, and most half serrated knives are in fact on the bottom half of the knife. And I think the reason why is because of what I was saying earlier about how cordage is going to be cut in the field. You're going to be taking the piece of cordage, doubling it back in your hand, and then inserting the knife through that hoop and then cutting it that way. So if you have the serrations on the back half of the knife, it just gives you a lot more control and cutting force. Whereas if you're holding a knife like this and you're cutting through cordage, well, now you're getting out toward the tip and you just don't have that strength to sort of rip through the cordage. So the reason why manufacturers will choose to put the serrations at the bottom half of the knife more often is for that purpose. But as I already indicated, for my use case scenarios, I prefer serrations on the top half, because whenever I'm out in the field, if I'm going to be using serrations, it's going to be for food prep. Food preparation, it just makes it a little bit easier to saw through bread. It makes it easier to saw through, meat. If you're cooking a steak on the grill, you can take this and you can cut it. The serrations are really nice there. But then you still have the plain edge on the back half of it for if for wood cutting, purposes. If you wanted to sharpen a pencil, you can just pick it up and you can turn the blade this way and you can use that plain edge to cut the pencil. It makes it easier to sharpen tent spikes, tent pegs, and all kinds of other bushcrafting and woodling applications. It's just nicer to have the plain edge there on the bottom. So this is a knife that if I'm looking for a single carry option for an extended hike, if I don't want to carry multiple blades with me, this knife here, the one-handed trekker, is a great option for me. Now, I have this knife here. This is the Opinel number 8, and I've done a video on this in which I was talking not so much about the knife, but I was talking about how I added that little 550 cord lanyard to the factory lanyard that came with it. I'll put a link in the description and somewhere above as I'm talking about this. But if this knife were available without serrations, I would have purchased it. This is specifically the Opinel Outdoor series. It's got the whistle for safety applications. I got this because my dog is trained to respond to a whistle, so that's the reason I have it. But of course, it would in fact, serve its purpose for survival if you were ever lost out in the wilderness. But because it's intended for the outdoor application, they put the serrations toward the back of it with the idea that you're going to be using it to cut cordage and to cut rough fabrics and that sort of thing. So I'm going to put that off to the side, and now I'm going to put this off to the side. And this knife here is an example of the knife that comes with a non-serrated blade and a dedicated serrated blade. So for two different purposes. This one specifically, the serrated blade, is referred to as a gutting blade. Now this is called the Hunter, so this is for the purpose of field dressing field dressing what you have captured in the process of hunting. Most people that buy this probably aren't using it for that application. It would really get this knife quite dirty, but of course that is the use case scenario. For me, whenever I'm using this, it is for cordage and also a little bit of food prep. Just as you can use the serrated blade on a knife such as this for food prep, you can use this knife for food prep. I've used this to cut into baguettes. If you want to cut a baguette, boy, good luck with cutting into a baguette with a smooth, polished blade such as this. It is going to be tough sledding there. But the little serrations on this knife really make it easy for food prep. And also if you're sitting in a hotel lobby eating that continental breakfast and you have this little baguette in front of you, you can pull out this blade and it's not going to freak out anybody. You're not going to be having this giant sharp knife on the table in front of you. You know, it's got the standard red Victorinox, and it's got that tiny little, hooked blade that looks very inoffensive and certainly doesn't look tactical or threatening in any way. So I like it for that application. And just as an aside, this knife used to look like this one. This knife here I've had for 20 plus years. It is very pocket worn. The knife, whenever you get it new, it has this sort of, it's not the traditional Celador, it's this, it's kind of nylon, polymer scale that's a little bit more textured. The texturing is on this knife, because it's so pocket worn, has been completely worn off. And as such, so has the painted on emblems. But this is what the emblems used to look like. I'll bring that up to the camera a little bit better vision there. And again, this has been discontinued, but you still can get them new from Amazon, and they're readily available in the secondary market also. Oh, and another thing that I'm going to mention here, and I'm just going to try to crowdsource some information. I have noticed in the 111 millimeter models of the Victorinox line that the springs, after a couple of decades of heavy use, such as this one has had, the back spring gets a little bit weak on the return, putting it back. So you notice there it had pretty good snap. I'll sort of inch it forward there. So you can hear that nice positive snap whenever it is opening. But whenever I go to close it, let me put it down here so you can see. I'll put my finger here at the very tip so you can see how far I'm actually able to go down before the snap takes place. Right there, about half an inch or so away from the knife. On the newer knife, and this knife is about 15 or so years newer than this one, the snap on the return is much more aggressive. And I'll put my finger at the tip there and slowly move it forward for this non-scientific test there, right there. So you can see it's about 2.5 inches away from the knife whenever the snap engages. And that's something that I've noticed that all of Victorinox's 111 millimeter series have in common, that the blade, that the back spring gets a little bit sleepy on the return. So if you have encountered that in some of the knives that you've put through a couple of decades of use, please let me know in the comment section. Or maybe I just got a lemon that I need to return to Victorinox and have some work done on it. Now, another example of a knife that has two blades on it, one plain and one serrated. This is a knife, this is the MKM Campo 8. I did a review on this a couple of months ago, and again, I'll put a link in the video and in the description. The main blade has the M390 particle steel, and it has a secondary blade that has serrations on it. So once again, they're just giving you two blades with two different cutting applications, two different use cases. And those are all, designed, the serrated blades are designed for the purposes that I've already discussed. For everyone's, different people have different use case applications and EDC needs. But for me personally, what I have found is that the best use of a serrated blade comes in multi-tools. I think with multi-tools, the serrated blades really come into their own. And these are a couple of multi-tools that I've had for 30 or so years now. This one I got in the early 90s when I was stationed at Fort Ord, California. This one I got in the late 90s whenever I was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And apart from the pliers, the single most used tool in any multi-tool I've ever used has been the serrated blade. So this is the first generation Gerber, and this has some rust on it. I took this on an extended mountain bike, mountain bike / camping trip in the late '90s, mid to late '90s, whenever I was stationed at Fort Bragg, and we got rained on, and this was in my pouch that I had when I was on the bicycle. That was on my back, and because I was leaning over riding a bike all day, the bike the pouch got wet, and of course this got wet, and it stayed wet for just about an entire weekend. And so it's got a lot of little rust spots on it, but you can see, where's that serrated blade? This serrated blade has seen a lot of use. I didn't bother to clean it up too much for this video, but the serrated blade on any knife, this is my first generation Leatherman super tool, and just as the most used implement on any plier-based multi-tool is going to be the pair of pliers. But beyond that, for me, my use case scenarios, the second most used implement on a multi-tool is that serrated blade. And the reason why is because I always already have a knife on me that has a plain blade. And thus, whenever I am in a field situation where I need access to a serrated blade, I have the secondary blade on my multi-tool that has the serrations on it. And I think they're extremely handy and useful in that case, in that kind of use case scenario for me. The serrated blade, as I've already indicated, is great for cordage and for fabrics, but in automotive applications, it's great for tubing, for hose, for radiator hose, water hoses. It's great for that. A regular utility blade can do it. It will do it, but not as efficiently as the serrated blade. The serrated blade gets in there and will just tear through radiator hose. And I remember one specific application. I was changing the heater core on my 1992 Toyota truck 4x4. And I was, the process of changing the heater core in that vehicle is utterly horrible, because if you go by the factory manual, you have to completely remove the dashboard and go through the firewall and change the heater core that way. So what I did was I rerouted the heater core, and I rerouted the heater core so it was accessible from the hood, from the bonnet, as they say in the UK. And I was in there and I was in the process of doing that, and I got to the point where I had my hands embedded in the engine, and I needed to cut some of the water hose. And I didn't want to drop everything and walk back to, I'm a shade tree mechanic, and so I was, 10 yards away from the garage. I didn't want to have to walk all the way back to the garage and get a dedicated tool for the purpose of cutting through that hose. But I had my multi-tool on me, and so I just pulled it out and accessed that serrated blade and got through it. And you can see this blade here, it has a little bit of wiggle to it, and the reason it has a little bit of wiggle to it is because I have used the heck out of this blade. It has been invaluable to me, and I've used that serrated blade far more than I have used the main blade in the knife, because I don't need the main blade of this knife, because I already have a knife that has a plain edge on it. So this blade hardly ever gets used, but the serrated blade gets used all the time. And one other thing I will mention about serrations and the whole plain edge, serrated edge debate is something I mentioned in passing earlier, difficulty in sharpening. So let me pull this back out. And some people like to maintain that people that like serrated edges are just terrible at sharpening, because a serrated edge will stay sharper for longer than a plain edge. Now, of course, the downside of that is that they are a pain in the butt to sharpen, and that's one of the reasons for my bias in favor of plain edges and against serrated edges. But again, I do love a serrated edge in certain use case scenarios. And I'm going to talk about some options here for sharpening it. One of the options is just a cheap little implement like this that has this little diamond sharpening rod. And that diamond sharpening rod, you'll notice that it is conical. It has a larger diameter there at the base, and it has the smaller diameter at the tip. And the reason for that is because it will fit into different size serrated grooves. So try to get this on camera without the glare. You see it has that long sort of swooping serration there, and then it has that narrower serration right there. Well, with the conical diamond file, you can find the correct size, and then you can just work it back and forth, and so that you can sharpen the blade without removing the individual teeth of the serrations. So this one here, this one's serrated on the opposite side of the blade, and once again you'll see how some of those serrations have the big teeth and some of the serrations have the little tiny groove separating the teeth. And you just find the proper diameter on the diamond rod, and then you can go back and forth and you can sharpen it that way. Also, you can use, if you have the Spyderco Sharp Maker, and this is a Spyderco Sharp Maker that I bought in the mid-80s. If you have one of those, because it has the triangular shaped rods, you can also use this. You can hold the blade steady, and then using one of the edges of that triangular point, you can work it back and forth to hone the knife that way. And you also have the option of using something like the Victorinox little handheld diamond file sharpener. It is, I don't know how well that's going to show up. You can see how it's sort of, oval in shape there, so it doesn't come to as fine a point as the triangle on the Sharp Maker, but it does come to a fairly nice point there, so it can get in between some of those smaller little points. And so you can use that to file that, and then you can use it in a twisting motion like that to get into that space between that larger groove there, not groove, that larger swoop between the teeth there. And one other option that I will mention for sharpening serrations is a strop. I like to use the furry edge of the rough edge of the leather and put some compound on it. In this case, I have the white compound, and you can use that strop to sharpen the serrated edges, because that leather has just a little bit of give to it, and because it has a little bit of give to it, it can press between the grooves of the serrations as you are stropping it. Now, if you do this, if this is the only way that you sharpen your knife, it will eventually wear down the serrations. But this is a very field expedient method of sharpening serrations. And so if you're out in the field and if the only sharpening mechanism that you have with you is a strop, which is not uncommon, it is a fantastic, a lightweight, effective means of sharpening a knife out in the field. And one of the benefits of it is that you can sharpen both a plain edge and a serrated edge, because that leather naturally has a certain amount of give to it, and you can use it to sharpen serrated edges. So this one is the sharpening bevel is on the opposite side, so I'm going to twist it that way. And once again, to sort of press it into the strop, press it into the leather, it's going to give in a little bit, and then you just press in and let that polishing compound and let the strop do its work, getting in those serrations. Now, again, as I already mentioned, that will eventually wear down the serrations, but if it's just a once-in-a-while thing, field expedient method, it will work. So I think I have now touched upon all of the things that I wanted to talk about for the purpose of this video, so I'm going to go ahead and let you go. I'm going to thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Goodbye.